really are out there that are worthy of the time and attention of a documentary. Why one about alcohol?
Well, I think, everyone here probably knows this. Risky drinking is maybe one of the biggest health problems in our country, and unfortunately women are catching up to men. We felt the need to talk about this openly and understand this sort of wide spectrum between no problem and alcoholism. We thought that was something new and important to shed some light on, and also to shed some light on the big questions people have. Do I need to stop? And can I moderate?
Dr. Koob, two-pronged question for you. When you think of partnerships, you may think of Fred and Ginger. You don't necessarily think of HBO and the National Institutes of Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism. Why did you agree to do this with HBO?
Well, I think all the issues that Ellen raised are big issues for us in society. Alcohol is a bigger cost to society than all the rest of the drugs combined. And the cost to our healthcare system is enormous. And if we were actually able to prevent and treat alcohol use disorders, you'd save a ton of money on healthcare costs. I don't know whether you realize it, but half of liver disease in this country is caused by alcohol. And I'm sorry to say, but when you drink the quantities, that the individual at the end of drinking, it's almost inevitable that he's going to destroy his liver. And we're seeing this shift in liver disease to young people. We had surgeons at Hopkins who were doing a liver transplant in an under 30-year-old. So, I can't emphasize enough how serious it is. And the other piece that Ellen mentioned that I think is really critical is the stigma issue. We think it's a brain disorder. I have to tell you, I know it's a brain disorder. I've looked at the brains, right? And, we're hoping that if we accept it as a disorder, just like Stephen said, we treat it like diabetes, hypertension. You don't treat somebody for a 28-day detox for hypertension and then turn them loose. So, those are the two major reasons that I can think of.
Dr. Koob, for so long, I think that we have looked at alcoholism and alcohol abuse as an either-or. You're either fine or you're all the way like a Neil. And this concept of a spectrum is so important. And the fact that you move all over it, and because you're here on a spectrum, doesn't mean you're becoming Neil. You go back and forth. Can you talk a little bit about that?
There are some individuals, the rest of my colleagues can talk to this a little bit, but there's some individuals that actually stop smoking on their own. Or like Mark Twain said, it's easy to stop smoking. I've done it 100 times. But, there are individuals who stop drinking on their own, but there are other individuals who do very well in Alcoholics Anonymous, and there are other individuals who do well in intermediate steps. But the earlier you start, the worse the problem. And the other piece that we emphasize a lot at the Alcohol Institute is underage drinking, because if you start binge drinking at 12 years old, you have a 4-fold, 5-fold higher likelihood of an alcohol use disorder later in life. And we already have data that shows that frontal cortex I was talking about gets affected more in adolescence because it's still growing. Any of you who raised a teenager know what I'm talking about. The frontal cortex doesn't fully develop until the age of 25. Right?
I thought it was like 50.
And then it starts going down.
Yeah, right, exactly. Okay, I want to let everybody have an opportunity to ask these incredible experts some questions. I obviously could go on and ask questions, but yes.
My question is, alcohol is pervasive in our whole society, and to all of you who are dealing with it, the medical and the psychological side, my question is, it's part of our entire culture. There's a bar on every block, and to what extent is the rest of society culpable in, enabling this?
For whatever reason, alcohol is sort of given a pass from a public health perspective. I think we went after alcohol about 100 years ago with Prohibition, and if you were to go after any drug, that would be the one drug to do that. But that led to the rise of Al Capone and the mafia, and it led, and it was a small group of people. It was about, less than 10% of the population. There was a temperance movement, And the rest of the United States said, you know, we want to be able to use alcohol. And that led to the repeal, you know, it was a constitutional amendment. And really from that point on, there really has not been a public health campaign against alcohol in any way, other than maybe Mothers Against Drunk Driving. You know, people used to not know that tobacco was a problem. Everyone knows tobacco is a problem now. You go to the movies and you can, you know, you're bombarded with these images of tobacco being bad. And alcohol, you know, you wouldn't know it. You go to college and you think the culture there is to drink. You know, when people think of alcohol, they don't think of something bad. When people think of crack cocaine, they know it's bad. So it's so pervasive in our culture, and it's so normative, and it's kind of the worst drug of them all, hidden in plain sight. So it's really going to take a big effort. And doctors aren't trained in addiction. We have all these great treatments, but they just sort of remain on the treatment shelves unused.
Carrie Wilkins is the co-founder and the clinical director of the Center for Motivation and Change here in New York. Carrie, do you have anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think it's a great comment, and I think it's part of what contributes to making change so hard. You know, there's a lot of substances that you can avoid if you decide you don't want to use them. Smoking and alcohol, they are readily available, and when somebody's trying to make changes and it's everywhere in their life, and they're walking by a bar or their friends drink heavily, it makes it very complicated. Like Dr. Koob said in the film, you really have to change your whole life and everybody in it. And there's a lot of habit and there's a lot of conditioning that contribute to making those changes really difficult. So, and because it's so accessible. And I also think we went to a couple of public health departments and we're talking to the young adults about just how normalized it is, and the heavy drinking is normalized. You've got Girls Gone Wild and you've got people posting all these great pictures, you know, so they paint this picture of this is great. And they're not talking about what's actually happening the next day when they're feeling horrible and, you know, like I said in the film, they're breaking up with their boyfriends and they feel bad about themselves. So I think the more we can get college kids and peers to actually say, hey, I'm worried about you, or, you know, let's try this instead of that. And I think this film has the potential to really help people try to talk about this, because that's the other thing that we really notice is people watch the film and they're like, I know somebody like that. Know somebody I really care about is just like that. How can I talk about it? And I think that's a great opportunity that we all have to really start talking about it.
We, at the Institute, basically urge people to go toward abstinence, but we'll take anything in between, all right? So that's my view. That's what Deidre and I have talked
Deirdre,
about many times.
You want to add to that?
The consensus in our culture is that abstinence is the healthiest goal, but it's not for everyone right away. So we want to take people where they are and accept them and not judge them where they are.
Either you were going to give it up, and if you weren't ready, that we'd wait for you to hit rock bottom, and then you could start talking. And it's really changed. It's, I think, a kinder and more gentler treatment model.
And we will be evaluating all these different recovery programs because I just made it part of our strategic plan for the Institute. So hopefully we'll be able to get you some information 5 years from now.
My question for one of you all is, with someone like Neil, what's the difference between day 29, day 34? He's looking much better. He's clearly, something good is happening. And on day 35, excuse me, it all goes to hell in a handbasket. What happened? And I'm not talking specifically about Neil as much as when people seem to be doing so well, what goes wrong?
You know, it's a great question, and following Neil over the course of these several years, to see him get better so often, and then just to have him relapse. Dr. Ross?
Well, the majority of relapses happen in the first sort of several months in sobriety, and it depends how far along someone is. Addiction is in many ways a memory disorder, so there's so many triggers, environmental cues, triggers, emotions that cause and conspire for someone to have a relapse. So it takes a huge effort to get someone sober, and relapse is the norm, slips are the norm. And when somebody's drinking so much they're in withdrawal, that process even more drives using from a biological perspective, as you could see in the last segment. So the brain really changes, and there's all these sort of triggers that lead to the person picking the drug, even over their kids. We saw in one of the segments, you know, alcohol use is so insidious, you eventually think that your relationship to it is more important than your kids. So your brain is, you know, completely tricked into thinking this thing is part of your survival when it's actually killing you.
relapses can occur because actually the underlying depression has fully
Yeah.
flared up, and they really, really don't want to drink, but their depression is so insufferable and painful that drinking makes perfect sense. So you actually have to be able to treat lots of things around the problem. And I think helping families know how they can help is another thing that is really missing in our society, because and the medications that are underutilized. I mean, the number of people actually getting treatment and getting good treatment is unbelievably low. And people don't know about medications, and they don't know about their options. So I hope this film gets people knowing about that as well.
I'd like to just say one more quick thing, and that is, we talk about the physical withdrawal, but for me that's just a marker. Because in protracted abstinence, you can go months, but you're still hypersensitive to emotional pain. And so somebody can just say something, you know, and boom, it can be a trigger, as Stephen was saying.
I think one thing that wasn't really addressed in the film is the cost of treatment, and the fact that many people don't have access to treatment, and it's prohibitive, and particularly private treatment. And I'm just wondering, in terms of how we address this as a public health issue,
It's a great point.
if you all would talk about that a little.
Addiction is the worst medicine, the worst disorder to have in all of medicine. Insurance companies don't pay for rehabs. There is a parity law that is really not being followed, and the Affordable Care Act has been trying to force insurers to pay for addiction treatment the way they would for other medical disorders, but they aren't. And if you have a lot of money, it's bizarre. You can go to these fancy rehabs, pay $50,000, $60,000, and really you'll mostly only get 12-step. A lot of them won't even give you the pharmacotherapy. So even when you're spending a lot of money, you're not getting good treatment. And there's very few places that actually provide good treatment. And so we have a big problem. We have a treatment system that doesn't really exist in any robust way, and we really have to build on that. It's going to take a long time.
You talked about the rates of alcoholism and addiction going up in women. And I'm wondering, I hate to ask this question, is there an increase in fetal alcohol syndrome? That's one question, and which I hope the answer is no. And do we know what implications this has for reproductive health and genetics?
The answer is the jury is out. We're obviously very concerned. We do have a large epidemiological study in the field now that is looking specifically at that, rates of fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. We're hopeful. The early evidence is concerning, obviously. But yes.
That data will be out this spring, but the rates are for the spectrum disorder are close to those of autism.
Yes, so to go up there.
Hi.
Dr. Tatarsky.
Yeah, I'm Andrew Tatarsky.
Everybody, Dr. Andrew Tatarsky, who was enormously helpful to us in this process.
Yeah, so I think you did a wonderful job portraying, you know, the diversity within the problem drinking population. You talk really compellingly about the brain aspects and the social aspects, but what I didn't hear so much, although it's sort of certainly represented in the stories, is the psychological dimension, the meaning that that alcohol has in people's lives, the function, the role of trauma, and the importance of psychotherapy. You know, you allude to cognitive behavioral therapy, but so that's one thing that I'd love to hear you speak to. Secondly, of the 80 million Americans with significant alcohol, most of whom are in the mild and moderate, and binge levels, how realistic is it to really promote abstinence, and even how necessary is it for the majority of people in those earlier stages of the substance use disorder or alcohol use disorder?
It's complicated. It really is. And every single when I watch those clips, I can see the function of the alcohol use in every single one of them, whether it's I'm coping with a breakup or I'm coping with loneliness, I'm overwhelmed, I don't know how to say no in the context of my friends. I mean, there's multiple things that are acting as the function, and that's part of where treatment can really help, is be able to say, okay, you're using alcohol for this purpose, and it started out probably working really well. I mean, that people don't drink because they're crazy, they drink because it works in some way. So to be able to help them understand, okay, let's give you other skills, or let's help you understand the problem in a different way and look at your life and shift your life around so that you don't need this chemical to achieve these goals, I think is really empowering for people, because they don't they don't want to, I mean, none of those people in those videos said, this is awesome, this feels great. They're all struggling with it. They all articulate feeling really bad about it. So I think to be able to offer people multiple pathways out and be able to treat all the things around the problem is super important. And I think that's where the system has failed so far, is that they've just said, just take the alcohol out. Like, just stop drinking. When it's just a massive, it's all parts of your life that need to be addressed. So I'll say that piece of it. These guys can speak to
Anybody,
the...
Deirdre, Dr. Ross? George?
I just want to correct a fact, though, which is about 14% of the U.S. population meets the severe category of alcohol use disorder, okay? It's not as, maybe twice that many have an alcohol use disorder. But it's a large number of people.
Go ahead.
Just
Dr.
a
Roach.
note about the depression and anxiety end of this is a huge issue for women. By some estimates, women are almost twice as likely to experience depression and anxiety in their lifetime, and that split in the rates of depression and anxiety begins in mid-puberty. So quite early, we see that's the time when girls are receiving a lot of messages about their worthiness or lack thereof. We see them having serious problems with body image. We see them doubting their ability to be the physicist or the engineer or the mathematician, doubting their intelligence, and they're learning shame.
The key is going to be how do we get the young people who say, this is what we do, to stop thinking that way. Because that's what they'll tell you. When we were growing up, when I was growing up, even if you did drink, it's a few drinks, it's 5 drinks. These guys are doing 24. And so what we saw tonight is not unusual, and I don't think people realize it, and I don't know how we're going to stop it. And that's what I want to get the answers to.
I just want to say that that's why we joined with HBO to do this project. We have to change the culture around drinking. And there is a culture right now that promotes the binge drinking, and we see it steadily increasing. We're taking steps at NIH. I mean, we have sent out what's called College AIM. It's a matrix of prevention programs to every university in the country. And the Surgeon General just released a Surgeon General's report, the first one on addiction ever, and that was a week ago. So, I mean, the timing of this, from my perspective, is perfect.
I have a question for Dr. Coop. With marijuana being legalized in more and more states, do you think, is that going to help or hinder the addiction issues with alcohol?
There was a concern of the beverage industry that legalizing marijuana in Colorado was going to reduce their sales, and it's been the opposite. So at this point, we are working with the National Institute on Drug Abuse. We're charting the changes in use of marijuana and marijuana use disorder with alcohol use disorder, very specifically in the states that have changed their laws. We're following the laws, we're following the epidemiology. And so there's a lot of activity in that domain, but the answer is we just don't know at this point.
We're going to take 2 more questions. Yes.
Just a quick question for those of us who safely enjoy a glass of wine in juxtaposition to risky drinking. What is safe drinking, and how do we measure that for ourselves? Obviously, the film gives us a lot of different examples of possibilities in terms of what could happen, but how do we kind of live our lives in a way that helps us not get to that point?
Really, like, examining your relationship with alcohol and, like, never needing it for a purpose, right? I mean, if it's like, I need it to reduce my stress, I need it to avoid this pain, I need it to, those are when you should be like, what am I relying on this so much for? Being able to have days off, multiple days off, in the case of women, not drinking more than 3 drinks. In the case of men, not drinking more than 4, so you're not binging. There's all sorts of like kind of numbers you can throw at it, but I think it's really being able in yourself to really know, it's not causing me any problems, and I don't need it. And those are really, if you can kind of grapple with those questions within yourself and be honest about it, I think that's a really important step.
We're going to take one last question. Yes.
Hi, Dr. Ross, you had commented in the film about a couple of pharmacotherapies. I was wondering if you could comment perhaps on the ongoing NYU trial with psilocybin.
Well, we have an active experimental trial using psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy to treat alcoholism. LSD was part of psychiatry from the 50s to the 70s, and there were thousands of participants that were treated with LSD, and there were randomized controlled trials. But psychedelics were banned in 1970, but there's been a reemergence of research in the last decade or so. And there's a couple groups in the US that are studying psilocybin for addiction. We're doing it for alcoholism at NYU. Johns Hopkins is studying psilocybin psychotherapy for tobacco addiction, University of Alabama for cocaine addiction. So, but that's a very experimental treatment. We don't know if it works. We have very good medications we know that work. There are 3 FDA-approved ones, and there's a whole bunch of other ones, and we're not using them at all. Before we start giving alcoholics really experimental treatments, there's so many standard biological treatments, psychotherapies that we can do, and we really need to improve doing all that first.
And more information on the film, you can find it on HBO.com to learn more about that. I want to thank all of our amazing experts so much for your time. And we can never thank our participants enough, ever.